So just a few words about Adam before he starts. As I said, when I was the head of department when Adam first started at the University of Birmingham, back in 2016, was it January? Very early January 2016. I believe I think he got straight off the plane and went straight into his first class, more or less, because he had a conference on the way here. We almost didn't have Adam in our department, because when we advertised for a lecturer, we weren't advertising for a lecturer in sign language linguistics, we were advertising for cognitive linguistics. And then I got this email from this Adam Schembri in Australia asking if he could have a quick Zoom call to have a chat about the department and his suitability for the department. And we had this phone call with the very, very, very impressive Adam, who talked about his work in sign language linguistics in an extremely compelling way, in a way which made me realise the importance of the work, both societally and theoretically. But he also, most of all, he's extremely engaging. He got me hooked straight away, and I thought, we need to interview this guy for our department. He did his interview also on Zoom and impressed the whole interview panel and all the members of the department who watched his presentation. It was a unanimous decision, easy, straight in, in like Flynn, as they sometimes don't say. So Adam arrived. I've been really privileged to have Adam as my neighbour, both at work and at home. So as my neighbour at work, he had the office just over the corridor from me. And it took me a while to get used to the phenomenon where there'd be complete silence coming out of his office and then guffaws of laughter. And then that's when I twigged he was having the meetings in BSL, so I don't sign, so I'm not going to, yeah. And so that was really nice. That was a really nice sort of like introduction to Adam's personality. And then for a short while we had Adam living in our road during the COVID pandemic, and that was where we learned of Adam's love of Victoria sponge cake, or as he refers to it, the Vicky sponge, isn't it? And my husband sitting over there is the king of the Victoria sponge. So Adam would come round for a socially distanced Victoria sponge. We'd put a little chair out on the pavement for him, and he would sit and have his sponge cake. And so it's been really nice. And the other thing, just one more thing that I remember from the period when Adam lived in our road was when he accidentally locked himself out of his house, putting out his bins without his shoes on. And so we had Adam ringing at the doorbell in his socks, needing to borrow some shoes and get sorted out. And I think that's the one and only time we'll see Adam wearing a pair of Crocs. So back to the more serious stuff about how Adam, in our department, since we've had him, he's made a huge contribution to our department, both in terms of his research, but also his personality, his charisma, his interest in his subject, but also his interest in us, and his constant need to and desire to engage with people in the department about our research and see the links. He's made a huge contribution, not forgetting, least of all, his charisma, which makes him fit really well in our department. So, as well as being all these amazing things on the social front, Adam is also extremely clever, which is why he's here and why we're all here. And to explain how and why Adam is really clever, we've got Kirsty, who's going to be talking about his linguistics. So thank you, Adam. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsty Cormier. I am the Director of Deafness, Cognition and Language Research in London, DCAL, UCL. And we are a research centre, a team of linguists, social scientists, and people who are looking at language and cognition. I'm a hearing social linguist, sign language linguist, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Adam today. Adam and I have been collaborating together in research for over 20 years. DCAL, where I'm a director now, first started in 2006. And prior to that, in 2005, Adam and I applied for a job to be the first researchers there. And I got the job, lucky me, but but actually both Adam and I started working there. And we together really need to thank Bensie Wall for that, because it was her decision to recruit both of us, because she could see the value in what we both bring, and we really valued that. So huge thanks to Bensie Wall for that decision. Adam and I worked together at DCAL for 5 years on many different projects, many different papers, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, and through that period of time, Adam got a grant for the BSL corpus, and it was amazing, really important, and continues to be a very important resource both for DCAL and the British deaf community. So, for me personally, I have valued working with Adam for many reasons. The first is from a scientist perspective. There are so many unique combinations of deep thinking on linguistics, which he has, as well as his big picture. He's a really big thinker on linguistics and on language. And the other thing I value is the social perspective. Adam is committed to social justice for deaf people. This is key for him. And so really that's all I want to say, and I'm very happy now to pass on over to Adam. So please join me in bringing him onto the stage. Wow. Thank you for that introduction. Well, I want to welcome everybody. It's so great to see so many familiar faces here. And I'm very happy that there are people who have come from far and wide. There are family here today. My sister is here, my nephew, my partner is here. And as well as that, there are people who have travelled from as far as Scotland. I think also there might be some European representatives here today. So thank you all for making the efforts to come. So today my topic is, how is sign language? And really, sign language can be understood in so many different ways. A sense of communication, a way to express ideas, emotions, to transmit culture, a way to tell jokes, to tell stories, poetry, theatre. And it's the way that children learn sign language, the way that people process sign language, all of these things. There is so much that we could talk about when we think about sign language. There are over 200 different sign languages across the world that have been identified. In a modern sign language research started in the 1960s in America, and that was when deaf and hearing researchers started for the first time to say that American Sign Language was not just random gestures, but actually there was a grammar of its own. And what really interested me was that structure. I was interested in, what is it? What does it look like? Does it look like spoken language structure? Is it different to that? And so what I want to do today is to answer those questions and to say, yes, actually, both are true, similar and different. And so today I'm going to talk about my research, and looking specifically at variation and change in two signed languages, Australian Sign Language, Auslan, and British Sign Language, BSL. I can talk about both because both of those languages have historical relationships. Next slide. I forgot I have the clicker. I'm in control. Let me... There. So I'm going to be looking at 3 levels of structure in sign language. Phonology, vocabulary, and grammar. And I'm also going to talk about why is any sign language research important? So maybe some of you are wondering, why are you here? Me, a hearing person, an Australian. And I'm standing here talking about British Sign Language at University of Birmingham. Huh? So really, it's been 30 years this year that my journey began. I was on a 3-year Auslan course in Sydney, Australia, and that course was life-changing. After the 3 years, I realised it was not enough. And so I started a PhD in linguistics in 1995 because I really wanted to understand more about the sign language structure, how it works. And so I finished my PhD 22 years ago, and I still want to know more. I'm very lucky. After my PhD, there were loads of opportunities to continue to work with deaf and hearing people doing sign language research. And I really benefited. I feel very privileged and lucky. Unfortunately, in that period of time, it has been much more challenging for deaf people to have those same opportunities that I had. And I think that's changing now. But we hearing researchers need to be mindful of constantly involving deaf people in our research. And one of the things I think that we'll notice today is that from my experience as a sign language student was how much these topics really fascinated me. I mean, of course, I love being in the classroom learning sign language, and it was really amazing because I have my level 6 teacher here today in the auditorium. But also, one of our interpreters is a daughter of one of my Auslan teachers as well. So, of course, I love learning sign language in the classroom. But I'm also well aware from a linguistics perspective that the language that you learn in the classroom isn't like fixed as it is in a dictionary. It doesn't follow the same rules of grammar in the same way that we're taught. There's changeability. And it's different from person to person, from situation to situation. It changes over time. Languages itself adapt. And the dynamic adapts as well. Some of the research that I will be presenting today comes from collaboration. All of it comes from collaboration and working with deaf people. So one of the things I must do before I continue is to say thank you to those many, many deaf and hearing people who have collaborated with me over the years. And I wish I could name every single one, but time doesn't allow. So what I would like you to know is that these people are what has enabled my work to happen. Without their support, it would not be.
So let's go back to the subject of my talk today. How is sign language? My perspective and my view, we can answer that question by looking at 3 different areas and factors related to sign language and signing communities. There are 3 things that really make sign languages and signing communities different from spoken language and spoken language communities. The first of those things is that sign languages, as you can see clearly, are visual gestural languages. You use your hands, the face, the body. Secondly, compared to spoken languages, many sign languages are relatively young. Many sign languages have emerged perhaps only over 100 years or so. Some of them even more recently. And I will talk more about that later on in my talk today. And then the third area that we can look at is that sign language communities are very different from spoken language communities. Many deaf people acquire sign language in a different way to the way spoken languages are transmitted. So I'd like to start now by looking at this area, the sociolinguistic ecology of signing communities. So of course, sign language communities are minority communities. And they are minorities by number, also by the power the community has, and there rarely is power in these type of communities, and also by access to resources, which is limited. And that is true in every single sign language community in the world. This is also similar with spoken languages. If you consider about 7,000 languages around the world, most of those languages would be in the same situation. But one difference when you look at signing communities is how the languages are transmitted. So sign languages like BSL and Auslan are rarely transmitted in the family. So most deaf people will learn their sign language from other deaf people, perhaps at a deaf school or a deaf club, for example. In the past, many deaf people would regularly go to deaf schools, and a lot of those would be residential schools. And that's what happened in the past. So in terms of transmission of the language, that would have been through school, and that was very significant. However, because of the mainstreaming of deaf children with hearing peers in hearing schools, the transmission has changed, and there's been an erosion of that traditional transmission. So when we talk about sign language communities, what does that look like? Of course, that will include both deaf and hearing people. Some deaf people and some hearing people have grown up in sign language families. Their heritage signers and sign language will have been in the family home. And if you think about the British deaf community, about 5% of deaf people have been born deaf with a deaf family, in a signing family. So that means 95% of the deaf people, their language experience can be significantly different, and that is very varied. And many people are like me, second language learners of sign language. And that population is growing. And there are a lot of hearing people like myself that have learnt sign language as an L2, as an adult. So we have many second language learners who are learning sign language. We have many heritage signers. And we also have people who aren't in either of those groups. Unfortunately, that will be because there have been issues with access to information, perhaps given by medical services or education in a particular area. And in the past, I think most people, if you're not aware of this, it might be an interesting fact for you, through most of the 20th century, in fact, sign languages were banned in deaf schools. And so what that means is for many deaf adults, the acquisition of sign language, their first language, hasn't been acquired until later on, and they perhaps acquire it as a second language, whereas it may have been their first language otherwise. And so we would term those group of people perhaps to have experienced language deprivation. It's very, very rare to have hearing people who experience language deprivation. It almost never happens. Very rare. But unfortunately, that is not in common with deaf people. Deaf people are much more likely to experience that. They may have been given incorrect information, parents by medical professionals or through our education systems. So, I've always been interested about the sociolinguistic and how sociolinguistics influence sign language structures and the relationship between those two things. And I'm really interested to see about people who have various different experiences. Is that replicated in their use of sign language, and does that produce variation? If you want to see variation and change in sign language, you really need a lot of data. And I'm very lucky because I've been involved in two major projects in this area, both in Australia and in Britain. In Australia, I was involved with the Auslan archive. There's two separate projects, but I'll talk about them both as one. In the Australian research, there were 255 deaf signers involved in that research that we collected data from, and they were from 5 cities across Australia. And I can say that was a really wonderful experience because I actually met all of those deaf people myself, so that was what a privilege that was. And the BSL Corpus project was a similar project. We formed 249 deaf people from 8 cities across the UK. So the research that I'll be doing from now on is based on the data that we collected in those 2 projects. Okay, so before I move on, I need to give you a little bit of education about basic sign language linguistics. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Matt. So, So sign languages contrast in 5 different features. So they have 5 parts, if you like. So firstly, hand shape. So each sign has a particular hand shape, a specific orientation, a specific location that it is articulated, a specific movement, and also an associated non-manual feature. And you can see the examples that are on the slide there. There are 2 signs that differ. So the first sign, seem and thank you, they are slightly different. They're the same hand shape, they're the same orientation and the same movement, but they differ in terms of the location that they are articulated, either from the nose or the chin. If we look at the next pair, paper and brother, everything is the same apart from the movement. So paper, brother. If we then look at the sign for praise and the sign for criticise, we can see that there's only one element that's different, and that is the hand shape. Okay, so when you're in a sign language class, you'll learn all of these things, and you'll learn about the 5 elements of the sign, and you'll learn the sign. And this is the citation dictionary form of the sign and the way it's articulated. However, what interested me as a learner is when you step out of the classroom and you see deaf people using sign language. Oh wow, it looks really different. That has always interested me. I've always been fascinated by that and think, where does that come from? And how do deaf people understand each other if these parameters are being used differently, if signs are changing in conversational usage? So what we did was we did a really big study. Okay, hold it there, Matt. Thank you. Okay, so you saw the sign don't know or not know there articulated. It's the same sign in Auslan and BSL. Signs like that are made sort of from the forehead upward, and that's where they're located. And there are many other signs like that. So in BSL, maybe mother, there's a sign for mother. Name also comes from that. No, from the forehead area. Blonde. But when you actually see deaf people using sign language, you see sometimes a lowering of the articulation of the signs that usually come from that area. So you see the same sign, don't know, in a sentence in the next example. We will swap after this slide. So did you see the don't know sign was lowered and was articulated lower on the face? So we really wanted to see what is happening in that lowering. How does that work? So, remember the Auslan archive, and we looked at 255 deaf people. We noted and identified from that 2,667 examples of this variation within conversation. And what we found was amazing, actually. Almost half of the signs that were normally articulated in that higher forehead location actually were lowered. Only 55% were made in this forehead area. And then 45% were made at other lower locations. And that explains a lot to me. That's why when I went to the deaf club and seeing deaf people signing, I didn't understand what they were saying outside of the classroom. So that explained a lot. Okay.
So we analysed the data, and what we found was that there were 2 key issues. Firstly, the high frequency signs were lower more often. And that's actually similar to spoken language. So, you know, high frequency phrases or terms get truncated, such as we would say dunno instead of don't know. And the other high frequency items not only are truncated, but they are also, because they're high frequency, they're easier then to recognize. If you're a fluent speaker or a fluent signer, the high frequency items come up more often, so therefore you're more able to manage the variance in your memory. You can store a whole range of options, and so you need less information in order for you to recognize a high frequency sign. And so we found signs like no come up a lot, and therefore the sign gets dropped right down. And sometimes it's so far down it's at the hip. It's like, oh no, it's coming right down low. And so you see that a lot. I think is another one. I think so, that drops down further. But with no, 80% of the time it is lowered. Now, what influences that is the sign preceding and following the sign. So if our the sign is key, and then we look at the sign preceding, it's where, and you can see they're both lowered if you look at the picture. And it isn't where it would normally be, but it becomes lower. And the dunno becomes lower. So then the key, then you have key, and then down after that, following is dunno, don't know. And so it's become lowered because the previous sign and the following sign are also low. But there's more. So when we analysed the data, we found there were also social implications. So there were the people who did the lowering, young people, people from the bigger cities, Sydney and Melbourne, which you can see on the map, but also women, which we found fascinating because we weren't expecting to find that. And actually, when we saw those changes in English, often it would follow similar patterns. And so quite often when the language starts to change in English, it starts with the younger people in the bigger cities, and sometimes also led by women, depending on what is being changed. So that's amazing. So even though the community structures are very different, nevertheless the same process is happening between Auslan and between spoken English. Okay. So now let's have a look at BSL. Now, I was just talking about phonology previously, but now we're going to look at vocabulary and some of the variations and changes there. So one example of sign variation is the sign for the number 6. In Birmingham, the sign is this. London, this. Scotland, and Manchester is wildly different. So you might ask why that happens. Well, when you think about the way that the deaf schools were set up in the 18th and 19th century around the UK, at the time, people didn't travel so much, and the schools were set up and they were in their own distinct areas. So children within their own school created their own signs, which therefore created a local sign, local to the school. And the thing is, these are regional variations that have strong connections to regional identity. So what we did was we studied, if you see, we studied 41 different number signs there were 4 categories. So there was numbers, colours, countries, and place names. The number and colour signs were very regional. You could really see a regional identity within them. So even the word for green here in Birmingham is green, like this. London, like this. Bristol. So, there we are. And just, I know I mentioned some of the number signs before, but with both of them, you see a strong difference in region. But with the country signs, a different thing is happening. So with the, in the British deaf community, there is more and more borrowing of signs that countries are using themselves. So for example here, the traditional BSL sign for Italy was this. I don't know why. But now more and more people will use the sign from Italy, which is this. And the same applies with America. So previously, the many British signers would sign America like this, or this, or this. There were quite a few signs for America, but now most people will use the American sign for America. Place names are interesting. So we found a lot of interest there. What we found is that deaf people within a community will have their own preferred sign, which is different to other people's preferred sign for that place. So let me give you an example. Let's look at Glasgow, Newcastle. So many people outside of Newcastle sign Newcastle, which is a two-signed sign, Newcastle. But people within Newcastle prefer NC, Newcastle. And so the patterns are similar to that. And unsurprisingly, the sign for London remains standard throughout. Everybody has the same sign. London. Yep. Why? I don't think it's because they're crazy, but... Oh, there's one more thing I was just going to say. There were 7,332 responses from 249 participants, and that came from 8 cities. So we had a huge amount of data for these. And the way we did it is we sat down in the areas with local people and asked them what their signs were, what was traditional for their region, and then we labelled them as either traditional or non-traditional. And so this is what we found, unsurprising. And this is what we heard from the deaf community. And that is that older deaf people used more traditional signs. And if somebody went to the local deaf school, they were more likely to use the traditional regional signs. And that makes sense. Both of those make sense. But also, deaf people who had deaf parents, which is, if you remember, 5% of the deaf population would be growing up in a household that used sign language, so they learnt to sign from their parents, who, you know, therefore it's an older person sign, so it carries on that tradition. And so therefore, people who had deaf parents were more likely to be familiar with the traditional signs. But you can then see the impact of that in the changes in deaf education. So the proportion of traditional signs starts to drop. So if you see on this slide, people in our research over 60, 80% of the time responded with the traditional signs, but in those who were under the age of 40, only 60% responded with traditional signs. And so you can see that the regional signs are still strong, and yet the picture is changing over time. And there's a real sense of this is a reflection of the change of deaf education. So as I said before, the centres of the deaf schools, which is where people were transmitting their sign language, deaf people are learning their signs from other deaf people at school. And if there aren't the deaf schools there, then it's changing. Deaf people are more isolated in mainstream schools and they're not receiving that. And then therefore there's less older deaf children around, and therefore it affects the transmission of those traditional signs. Eek. Okay, so I'm now going to focus on a different topic, and that is the visual gesture modality. Now, if you watch hearing people talk, you will notice that they point and use gesture. So sign language also has pointing and gesture, you, me, that. But one thing that's particularly marked, really unique to sign language, is that you can point with the sign itself. So to give you an example, the verb to, if you see above, send, right? Send. So if I want to send something to the interpreters, I send them a book, I can point to them, point to a book and send. If I was talking about them sending me the book, they could send the book. I send, they send. It's in the sign. So signing, for an example, the sign send, you can change, you can inflect it to show who is doing what to whom. You have a subject, you have an object. And it is this system which is actually being compared to agreement verbs, which you can see in Spanish. So when you see this word envío, it means that I send it. And envías, you send it. Envía, she sends it. So you can see the similarity in verb agreement in Spanish, where with directional verbs and this kind of agreement system. And because the verb in Spanish also includes the who's doing what, in the subject information is included within the object. And so you can remove a pronoun altogether. And it means the same thing. Okay? Yeah. Do they know?
Okay, so with the verb send, if there are people who are here, like the interpreters or people around me, I can use the verb in that way to send it to them. But what happens for somebody who's not here? When we're talking about somebody who isn't in the room, if you want to talk about somebody that isn't physically present and sending them something, what do we do in that case? So when you're learning sign language in class, or if you're reading, a textbook on sign languages, it will explain that you will set these people up, the subject and the object, in your signing space. And often you'll see an example like the example that we have on the slide here. Mary, and we place Mary, and John, and we index where John would be, and we articulate the verb between those two spaces. And that means John has sent something to Mary. Or if we send it the other way, starting with Mary, Mary sent it back maybe. I don't know. So that's what we see. If you see an example here from the BSL corpus, the send is going over to the side there. So what we wanted to do is think about this system. Do deaf people always do what we read in the textbooks? Do they always use this system of articulating direction verbs? So again, we analysed a large amount of data. 1,680 examples of directional verbs were identified. Not only send, but various other verbs like ask, for example. Tell, remind, inform, various different examples of directional verbs. We only analysed 4 cities just because of time constraints, and they were based all in England: Manchester, Birmingham, London and Bristol. And what we found was actually really interesting. Yes, deaf people do this a lot. However, not always. Around a third of the examples that we identified were like the dictionary sign that we saw before, send, a plain verb there with no modification, send. About 2/3, what we found were there were changes to the direction of the verb send. And the things that influenced the verb and whether it had directionality or not depended on who you were talking about. If you were talking about a human or an animal, you were more likely to modify that. And if you were talking about objects, that was less likely, so animacy was important. If you were talking about a specific person, so there was an element of definiteness, it was more likely to see modification of the verb. So, for example, if I said, I want to send my mum some flowers, I was more likely to send that directionally to my mum, who I'd set up in my signing space. If you were to say something like, I need to send a letter to someone in the government, and there was an indefinite person there, you're talking about someone, then you were more likely to use the dictionary form of the verb send, because you don't know where that person is. They're not set up in the space in order for it to be produced in that way. And also what we found, like Spanish, you were more likely to drop the pronoun if there was directionality inherent within the verb. Right, I need to just come and approach the computer and just check. I might need to do a little tweak. Please just watch this, okay? This signing, a little bit of signing here. Okay. So in this case, the deaf woman is talking about her experiences, the first time she ever saw sign language being used. Because she was from a hearing family, it was the first time sign language had been introduced to her. She went to a deaf school and she saw other deaf children and they were all signing. And you can see her reaction, she's gobsmacked. She's like, wow, what is that? Amazing. And it's shown in her facial expression. And at the same time, she's signing this. And this really means something that you are learning. So acquiring some knowledge. So she's set up the deaf school in the location to her right. And we can see the deaf children on the location to her right, and she is acquiring and looking at them and learning from them with amazement. And we can see that. If we were to set up, you made 2 third parties in the signing space, you can do that. It is possible in BSL, grammatically speaking. But if we, most of the time, what we found was that deaf people showed a strong preference for using their body to embody the subject. And that was so they were able to show the reactions of the subject, the facial expressions. And that is what we call constructed action. So it's sort of acting out the subject's feelings, what they're doing, what their reactions are to the specific situation that they're recounting. So we see that a lot. In textbooks examples, sorry, we don't see that a lot. As you saw before, with John and Mary and the example that I gave you, the kind of textbook example, that's something that we don't see to happen very often in natural conversation. Most of the time there is a strong preference for deaf people to use their body to show the subject. So for example, perhaps the teacher is asking a question of a student. You could sign teacher and set the teacher up and then move the ask verb through space like that. But people don't articulate it like that much. What you'll see is teacher use the body to shift to ask the student who you've placed in your signing space. So that was really interesting. So you can see that deaf people are making the most of the visual gestural modality when they're using their language in natural conversation. So, those are 3 past projects that I've worked on. I don't have time to talk about the projects that I'm working on really at the moment, but many of the people from my team are here. Hi guys, good to see you. You can see their faces up there on the board. So, this is a new project that I'm working on with the team, and it's an extension of what's come before. Looking at the same 3 factors, the ecology of signing communities, visual, gestural modality and young languages, and we're looking at variety in sign languages within those projects. We're looking at 3 broad categories of communities. I could talk a lot about why we're having 3 categories. It's a little bit problematic, but just to give you a snapshot really today, rather than going in any depth. So sign languages like BSL are what we call macro community sign languages. They are used by nations, they're used nationally. In our research, we're looking at 2 macro community sign languages, Portuguese Sign Language and British Sign Language. We're also looking at 2 micro-community sign languages. The first is Katakolok, that's from Bali. It's a small village with about 3,000 inhabitants and about 30 or 40 deaf people. And the deaf people in that village have been there for about 3 generations. So 8 generations. 8 generations of deaf people in that particular village. So the sign language is very unique to that village and has developed within the village setting. The other is the Kufakasem sign language. It's used in the Palestinian community in Israel. It's a little bit different. There are about 150 deaf people there. It's a town of about 25,000 people. Again, because of the high number of deaf people there within that village, it's a very unique sign language that has emerged within that setting. We also have what we're terming emerging sign languages. The signing communities which have emerged fairly recently in comparison, say, with BSL. So Nepali Sign Language is one of them. There's a deaf school that was set up there in 1966. And so the deaf community there has emerged around the same time. And Guinea-Bissau Sign Language, that's very different actually. I think the first deaf school there was only set up about 20 years ago. So we can see that's a really new community emerging within that particular setting. So we're trying to understand those three different signing communities and the three types of signing community there. I would really love to talk about that more, but unfortunately I don't have time to do that today. But please do watch this space, because my team will be presenting much more about this in the future, so do keep an eye out for that. Okay, so why is sign language research important? The first thing is, I'd like to think that sign language research has changed the whole study of languages. Because we know from BSL, for example, that we use facial expression, body movement, etc., and that's really important linguistically. And of course, that spoken language is the same in terms of having those elements within it. You can see a couple of examples here where you've got gestures that are used while somebody is speaking, so concurrently with their speech. There's an Australian woman there who's speaking in the top photo, and she's talking about two different airlines. And she's comparing the two of them. And when she does that, she gestures on the left and then the right to indicate the two different companies. And that's, you know, the same as we see in sign languages. And then this is really interesting work from our department, actually, for some researchers in our department. This is about hearing people in America, American English speakers. And this research has found that when somebody who is hearing and they're saying the phrase, a tiny number, 90% of the time they'll say that with a gesture. So you can see here a co-speech gesture. Amazing. So sign language research has really changed the way that we understand languages generally. So in 2022, the BSL Act happened, and that was the first time that BSL was officially recognised by the British government as a language. That was quite recent. However, it's quite different in New Zealand. New Zealand Sign Language was recognised by the New Zealand government way back in 2006. And the government there created a strategy for New Zealand Sign Language to promote the use of New Zealand Sign Language within the community. And the strategy has 5 targets, 5 elements. To promote the acquisition of sign language, the use and access of sign language, looking in terms of positive attitudes towards sign language, improving the status of the way the language is regarded. And all of those 4 goals are supported by sign language research or documentation. If the documentation and the research is better, you can improve education, for example, or educational tools. And actually, I've been very lucky to be involved with some projects where this has actually happened. So, for example, I worked with 2 deaf colleagues, and we made some sign language assessments for deaf children, assessment tools for children 4 to 11 years old. And you can see that here. Secondly, I worked with Kirsty and various other people, and we created the Sign Bank, an online dictionary of British Sign Language signs. And that's really exciting, actually, because also I've started working now with another project in Australia called Sign How. This is a deaf-led project, and it's a deaf-led sign language dictionary. And this is where deaf people can upload online their signs, so to create the dictionary from the deaf community. So I'm going to be working as an advisor within the team that are doing that particular project. Also, we've talked about language deprivation very briefly earlier on, and I could talk more about that, but I don't have time, very unfortunately. But I have also been involved in teams that are looking at BSL skills linked to sign language acquisition. And our work has provided the evidence to support bilingual education for deaf children. And this is a really important thing, and I think it's really important for all linguists to know this. It's a really big social justice issue. Many deaf people experience language deprivation, and that has to stop. It's really easy to stop it, actually. All you have to do is that you have to make sure that all deaf children have access to sign language. And actually, recently, the World Federation of the Deaf have made an announcement, or a statement, in terms of the education of deaf children and the languages of deaf children and the rights of deaf children. So the Declaration of the Rights of Deaf Children, as you can see here, came from the World Federation of the Deaf. Actually, I think sign language research and the impact it's had in terms of raising awareness of, the linguistics and human rights of deaf people is one of the most important contributions of linguistics over the last 50 years. I just hope that in some small way, my research has helped to achieve that goal, to contribute towards achieving linguistic human rights for deaf people. And next week, in the UK, it is Sign Language Week. So I wanted to make sure you all know that, and make you aware. Okay, if you can just click that, please, Matt. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.